Welcome to the Book of Exodus series on the Town and Field Church podcast. In this 40-day series, one of us at Town and Field will be taking a quick look at one of the chapters of Exodus and sharing some ideas around the text. To learn more about this reading plan and podcast, visit townandfield.ca/reading plans. Now enjoy today's episode.
Hey, it's Ryan, and thank you for joining me for Exodus chapter 25. If you're still reading along with us, awesome, keep it up, that's great. So in chapter 24, after a bunch of the law has been dispensed, God renews the covenant with Israel, and he reminds them of this relationship that they've entered into. And then also in chapter 25, he starts to unload these kind of crazy instructions about this big building project of this sanctuary that's ultimately going to be called the tabernacle. And he starts off by saying, tell the Israelites, tell the people to bring me an offering. So they start bringing all these different resources, and all these things, all these gifts. And he says, bring them to me. And then he immediately jumps into these instructions about this epic building project they're supposed to go into. And we're going to see the span for about the next 7 chapters of Exodus. And this is not always the most exhilarating reading, but I reference this kind of around the Passover feast that had all these instructions. Like we read this, we say, why all these details? Why all these details? And in fact, we don't have all the details of what this looks like, but we have a lot. And I believe that this is a representation of kind of the covenant that God's brought people into. He says, okay, we're going to have this relationship, and he reminds them perpetually, this is what I'm bringing to the table. But he does remind people of their place. He says, if you want to be in relationship with the Most High God who created the entire universe, then your posture, your position needs to be one of obedience. That might not sound appealing to many of us who like our autonomy and our freedom, but I believe there's a greater freedom in acting in obedience to the God who created the universe, who wired all of us, who created us in his image. And I actually think these details and all these instructions give us a glimpse of how intricately God cares about how we live and how we operate and how we function. He is invested in us. And we see this really cool line in chapter 25, verse 8. God says, then have them make a sanctuary for me, and I will dwell among them. I love this. We're going to start this building project, this thing called the tabernacle. Now, this isn't like a church building where it's like, we need this cool building. This isn't like, what this is, it's a symbolic representation of the fact that God is going to come and dwell amongst his people. This is revolutionary. This came out of Egypt. The Egyptian gods are not like this. The Egyptian gods in their minds watch from far off, like out in the distant lands of heaven or whatever you want to call it, watching their people toil in the heat of the day, watching their people struggle. And here God is, his people are walking through the wilderness, struggling. It's hot, they're thirsty, they're hungry. And what does he do? He says, I want to set up camp right in the middle. I want to be with you guys. This is a great picture of who Jesus is. Remember, the prophets called Jesus Emmanuel, which means God with us. And this is what we see when we read the New Testament about Jesus. He is God coming to dwell amongst his people. And this is what we have with the tabernacle, is this representation of God saying, I'm not far off, I'm not distant, I am with you. I'm not just giving you law from far off, I'm here to work it out with you. Then we see these instructions follow for these 3 items that are going to be built. First of all, the Ark of the Covenant, which is going to have the 2 stone tablets of the Decalogue printed on them in there. And then Hebrews seems to think that there's going to be like Aaron's staff and a jar of manna in there as well. So there's maybe a bit more detail going on than we know, but for sure these are in there. The Ark's going to be what's called the most holy place. We'll hear more about that later. Then we see this table of bread with kind of 12 loaves of bread are going to be on it, and also this lampstand. And these are both going to be in the holy place. So not the most holy place, but the holy place. And there are only 3 items in there. In chapter 30, we'll see the altar of incense, which is going to be in there as well. Now, we don't know for sure, but a lot of people would suggest that these are symbolic of some heavenly realities. We see that kind of idea unpacked in Hebrews 8, that Moses was seeing some heavenly realities. But probably a lot of this is a glance back at like who Israel is, and even what the Garden of Eden looked like. This lampstand kind of represents the tree of life, shining the light, the presence of God, and it reflects that light onto the 12 loaves of bread that sit on the table that represent the 12 tribes of Israel, saying that in the presence of the light of God, God's people dwell. God dwells amongst his people, so God's people get to be in the light of his presence. So as you read Exodus 25 today, as you meditate on it, I want to just encourage you to think about this God who dwells amongst his people, whether they're struggling in the wilderness, whether they're entering the promised land, whether they're living in Western Canada in 21st century, no matter what, this is a God who makes his dwelling place amongst his people and invites us to interact with him, engage with him, and enjoy a beautiful relationship with him.